One of the mistakes that some people make is that the spirit will actually turn up. You're not clairvoyant enough to see it, and it's literally standing outside the circle, jumping up and down. I'm speaking figuratively here, saying, "Oh, for heaven's sake, I'm here. Stop invoking me."
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the esoteric podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we are talking the fundamentals of Solomonic magic with internationally acclaimed author, practicing magician, and scholar, Dr. Stephen Skinner. Dr. Skinner takes the time in this episode to answer your Glitch Bottle Patron questions, and he also talks about some of the keys for magicians to keep in mind when practicing grimoire magic. Dr. Skinner has written dozens and dozens of books. They've been translated into more than 20 different languages. Dr. Skinner received his PhD in classics from the University of Newcastle for his research on the Greek text of the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri and a number of Latin grimoires. And in this episode, Dr. Skinner shares about some of his favorite manuscripts. Of the 5 senses, which ones are the spirits stronger in than others? Dr. Skinner also shares his take on ritual offerings, both inside and outside the circle, and what can go very wrong for a magician if the operation isn't executed properly, and so much more. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Dr. Stephen Skinner. Dr. Stephen Skinner, thank you so much for taking the time and coming back on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here again.
There are some questions that listeners had, Dr. Skinner, about more Solomonic magic-focused questions, an evocation, invocation. So to just kind of get started, there's a question from Damian Gordon, who is asking, when choosing a manuscript to work from, I think it's useful to know what kinds of results others have had from them. For example, Giulio Cesarotti's recent interview that he did was very interesting when he talked about working Mather's key, and he was able to produce an apparition, but not the necessary subsequent control, and had better success with the formula he gives in his book. So Damien says, I believe Dr. Skinner has worked the Goetia in the past. Is Dr. Skinner willing to share what manuscripts he currently works from, or is he willing to share about his all-time favorites and why, and how did the results differ between different systems?
I guess, like most other people, the Goetia is one of my favorites. Why? Because it's got a wide-ranging register of spirits, and the method, although not completely laid out in the Goetia, is purely Solomonic. With regards to results, these are not really a question of which manuscript you're using, because if you've got into the hang of evoking and you're using the right names and you're using talismans, then the spirits don't seem to be terribly picky. If you use the slightly wrong talisman, they will still come. In fact, sometimes they're rather over-eager. I started out with the Mather's Key of Solomon, as probably everybody else did, and moved on from there. But the Megaton and the Clavicular Salomonis are still amongst my favorites. There are a number of more obscure manuscripts that I've used.
This kind of echoes what John King mentioned when he was on the podcast, Dr. Skinner, just about how sometimes people can get trapped in either armchair magician focuses or comparing a specific sigil, like I have to get this exactly right, how it was scribbled into a grimoire 500 years ago, instead of focusing on the ritual at hand, focusing on specific procedures in terms of binding.
Yeah. I mean, you can always get feedback from the spirit. They're not slow at complaining about things that are defective in your ritual work. But the basic procedures, like calling them and then binding them and then dismissing them, are the key things, like the 5 main Solomonic ritual procedures, of which the most important is binding them. So people who get just an apparition turning up, but it won't talk to them, or they get the legendary slingshot effect talked about by Dr. Joseph Lazewski, are having those problems because they haven't got the spirit's attention and they haven't bound it. The spirits don't want to be here most of the time. You have got to almost seduce them into coming, and then when they're there, you've got to put, shall I say, silver handcuffs on them to make sure that they will come back when called and that they do what it was you wanted. Because for me, magic is results orientated. If the spirit doesn't do what it's asked to do, then it's not bound properly, or it's the wrong spirit. You always get the phenomena where you call a spirit to do one thing and it's not part of its office, and so it doesn't do it, or it does it in a very weird way. I've had a number of experiences where spirits have actually fulfilled the letter of the law of what I've exactly asked for, but not the spirit of the law. And I wonder sometimes whether that's because the spirits don't think like us, or whether they're being deliberately snarky and tricky. The jury's still out on that.
I remember you mentioned in the Goetia of Dr. Rudd that a lot of the instructions to the spirits are varied because many of the angel magicians also had background in law. They're written very specifically, like, you and your associates shall hitherto make sure to carry out without any harm or hurt to me or my fellows. Like, is that part of the ability to kind of cut down or reduce the trickery or potential trickery?
Yeah, I was always fairly dismissive about lawyers because I had some in my family and was not particularly fond of them. But since getting into magic, I realized that complete precision in commands is very important. Just to have a sort of crass example, if you had a servant and you said, just put those books back on the shelf, they would put them with the spines facing inwards or upside down or open or something like that. You've got to be specific with the spines facing outwards in the right subject category, blah, blah, blah. Now, obviously that's not a thing that you ask a spirit to do, because you can get up and do it yourself, because you shouldn't waste your time. You only ask spirits to do things that you cannot do normally through the normal channels. But if you specify it like a lawyer would, then there's less chance of a screw-up. So, as I said, I'm still not completely satisfied as to whether it's the general trickiness of spirits, and they certainly are tricky, or whether it's they just don't think like we do.
There's potential risk with trickery. There's also potential risk with actual physical things could go wrong for the operator, especially if you break the circle, the protective barrier. And to that point, Dr. Skinner, we have a question from Frater Phosphor, who's saying, I'd like to know from Dr. Skinner, what's the worst case scenario of a magician stepping out of the circle during ritual, or a magician not using defenses? And what's the worst that Dr. Skinner has seen or perhaps even heard from other magicians happening?
Well, let's start with the worst. I'm not going to tell you who the magician was, but this is a certain case. The magician concerned called up one of the demon kings. Now, I read a lot of fairly new agey stuff which says, oh yeah, you can call them up as if they were pets or something. They're not. The demon kings should be used as a threat for lesser spirits, but they're not the sort of things you want to call up yourself. And in this particular case, Payman was called up and was not bound properly and got out of control. Now, this was being carried out in a large house in the countryside in an area which wasn't known for tornadoes. In fact, it was in France, or storms or anything else like that. After it got out of control, it was the largest storm that has been seen in that part of France since the 14th century. And that storm blew in a couple of top floor windows and lifted 20 square meters of roofing tiles off the roof and knocked over 3 of the largest trees you've ever seen. That was because it hadn't been bound properly. I can give you newspaper cuttings to show that this storm actually happened, along with the timing of the ritual. Now, if you're a materialist, you can say, wow, that's just a coincidence. Yeah, how often do storms like that happen? And how often does that much destruction? It also took a swipe at some of the houses in the adjoining village and pretty much destroyed a barn. You don't get tornadoes. I mean, if this was Tornado Alley in the States, then you all say, oh yeah, that's so what? It wasn't. It was in a really nice rural area of France where you never get this kind of weather. That's probably the worst example, that the damage ran into many hundreds of thousands, probably millions. But there have been other occasions where foolish people have stepped out of the circle and nothing has happened. until later the same week, when suddenly they start to get the sort of dreams that, well, you just don't want to have those kind of dreams. They get woken up in the middle of the night with something in the room, all this sort of thing. These things can happen anyway, but they happen almost immediately after stepping out of the circle. And spirits are serious. They shouldn't be messed with. I sometimes make parallels between spirits and wild animals. And the parallel I like is training horses. If you have a wild horse, you can certainly bridle it and train it if you use the right methods and take the right precautions. If you don't know what you're doing, it'll kick you in the ribs and possibly break a rib or two. And the spirits are roughly the same. But if you do bridle it and calm it down, then you can come to a working arrangement with the spirits. I've never found the working arrangement with spirits as comfortable as some magicians claim to have, but it's a bit of give and take.
I love your analogy about horses, and also, as you've said, the carrot and the stick method, where, you can use carrots and have offerings and things like that, but then the stick is just that necessary precaution and barrier.
Yeah, some of my colleagues say, well, you shouldn't be horrible to spirits. I'm not horrible to spirits just for the sake of being horrible, but when you're training something like a wild animal, you do need to use the stick occasionally. It just makes the point.
When I recite the Heptameron, for example, one of the most amazing things about it is it's very beautiful, and there's, of course, strong language. I will consign you to the abyss until the day of judgment. But once the spirit is successfully evoked, and right before the binding is executed, there's this beautiful welcoming. Bene veneritis spiritus, welcome most noble princes. So there is this kind of deference, and respect for the spirits.
Yeah, indeed. This leads on to the question of offerings for the spirits. Yes, you sometimes do need to give them something back, and it can be at all sorts of levels, everything from a blood offering through to just incense. There's a classic case in one of I forget, somewhere in the Bible, where it says that the angels love to be sitting alongside the altar in the temple in Jerusalem because the smell of blood invigorated them. That's not a very good quote, and I'll look it up and do it properly later, but I think that offerings do have a place in magic. They certainly had a place in religion pre the Christian era.
To follow up on that, what is the relationship, and Frater Phosphor is asking this too, about offerings in general, in terms of course, during a ritual, as you mentioned, literally offering the incense, offering specific smells, specific perfumes is a critical part of ceremonial magic. But do you also employ offerings outside of the circle? So, for example, I'm just completely making this up, but let's say, Dr. Skinner's working with the Archangel Raphael and Mercurial spirits. So, of course, inside the circle, you would use the appropriate perfumes, but outside the circle, several days later, does it augment the efficacy of the magician to have a separate altar with non-ceremonial offerings? In other words, it's not a specific operation, but you're still putting things on the altar that have an affinity to mercurial spirits. Is that also something that you might engage in?
I know a number of people who do that. I can't see anything particularly wrong with it, but I don't do it. It's a little bit like a religious act there rather than an act of magic. People will say I'm a control freak, but I think magic is more about control than being nice and begging.
Dr. Skinner, we have a question from Damian Gordon, who mentions, when it comes to working with chthonic entities, the Solomonic formula is all about breaking the spirit to compel it to appear, regardless of whether you're a gifted scryer or not. So the question would be, with angels, is there more emphasis on needing a scrying ability versus just focusing on the technical method?
There's several different ways to interact with spirits. Whether it's chthonic or angelic, you can still use the scrying method to see it in the crystal, on your altar, inside the circle, because you're not inviting the spirit into the circle. What you're getting is an image reflection in your head or in the crystal. So that's one way. So that's quite separate from how do you speak to it. Do you compel it, or do you conjure it, or do you invoke it, or whatever? Even with sonic entities, you might try initially seducing them first before you start bossing them around. Even in the Goetia, the sequence of invocations gets stronger and stronger on the assumption that if you got to the binding chains or whatever, that everything else has failed. One of the mistakes that some people make is that the spirit will actually turn up. You're not clairvoyant enough to see it, and it's literally standing outside the circle, jumping up and down. I'm speaking figuratively here, saying, "Oh, for heaven's sake, I'm here. Stop invoking me." So, as Frater Ashen Chasen does, it's good to have a good clairvoyant present who can tell when the spirit turns up. If you're not and you don't have a good clairvoyant, then you look for the subtle changes in atmosphere. It's not Hammer House of Horror, but the temperature will frequently drop. And I've never taken a thermometer into a circle, but if you feel it's dropped, you know that something has arrived. There will also be changes in the incense pattern in the air, and sometimes a really strange shaking in the air. And you know it's arrived. So then at that point, you can continue without continually threatening it. You know, you must come, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. That's one thing. As far as angels go, the last book in the Lemegeton, that's Discounting the Ars Notoria, is the Almadel, and variations on Almadel with the wax super altar and the smoke coming through holes is very effective. Dealing with angels there, you're not going to be binding an angel. You're going to be asking them, not begging them, but just asking, will you please do this? If you're slightly sensitive, you'll frequently get some kind of atmospheric reaction which tells you that the charge, the command, the order has been accepted. So that's a sort of a slightly different way of working with it. With really chthonic entities, then some sacrifice may be necessary, or a promise of that. I find usually the promise, you're obviously burning the incense that the spirit or the angel likes, and you promise that on the completion of the mission that you're sending them on, then you will give them some other offering, which we can talk about later. Just going back to the front end of the operation, the difficulty for spirits is that for them, manifesting on the material plane is rather like us being underwater and holding our breaths. We can do it, they can do it, but for a limited amount of time. And during that time, a lot of energy is used up. So if they are able to sort of still remain fairly discarnate, but such that you can communicate with them and you can command them and they can acknowledge that command, that's a much better and more equitable way of working. And to make this physical world environment suitable for them, you put the right incenses in the air, because the fine particles floating in the air, they can inhale, they can smell it. They definitely got a sense of smell, which is quite refined. You offer galbanum to the wrong kind of spirit, they will not be happy. Frankincense will do for most spirits generally, but it's much better if you tailor it down to that specific planetary sphere. And then to drive spirits away at the end, you can burn the stinking things, which is where sulfur and brimstone comes in. I try not to do that because my lungs don't really like it, and a good license to depart is much more useful. The way the license to depart is structured gives you the clue. They are like a creature in another environment. You tell them you are licensed to leave, and 9 times out of 10, they will leave in a hurry. You won't have to do banishing rituals or anything else after that. And you wait in the circle, maybe a quarter of an hour, maybe just pray, maybe you just sit on the floor, and you will feel the atmosphere relax, and you know that they've left. You give it a bit more time, and then you can leave the circle. When I started this, I thought, well, the license to depart's very short. It's not very finger-shaking, but that's all that's needed. They just need to be relaxed. And, of course, if you've bound them, then the license to depart gives them permission to go, and they will act on that very fast. There's a great story about, who was it, Benvenuto Cellini doing invocations in the Colosseum. Oh, for the day when you could do that in the Colosseum without anybody bugging you. And he tried to get the spirits to leave at the end by burning stinking, but he didn't do the license to depart. So as him and his acolytes, his apprentices, walked home, they could still see the spirits dancing along the rooftops beside them, not actually harming them, but they were still present. I don't know how that finally finished up. So, going back to it, license to part, very important. You can actually add stinking asafoetida, something used in Indian cooking, interestingly. You can add those to give the final kick out the door, but usually just releasing the license to depart, they'll go willingly and in a hurry.
I was reading a little bit of John King's Imperial Arts, and I'd love for you to share with listeners, Dr. Skinner, just about the importance of addressing a spirit and actually declaiming the words and actually physically reciting the conjurations. And by that I mean, John King mentions, quote, "As with ordinary speaking between two people, there's a manner of voice that makes clear the intent to communicate rather than to merely recite from a written text." So I guess the question would be, can you kind of help out some of the serious listeners out there who, when it comes to reciting, are you reciting, in a Shakespearean way, or are you literally doing it, hey, I am talking to an actual entity that I can't see yet, so you shouldn't be yelling at them, you shouldn't be shouting at them. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. I can't say you should treat them like human beings, but yeah, all this binding and shouting has its place. If they're being really ornery, then you've got to be ornery in exchange. But you talk to them and you make it clear that you're not addressing a vacant space. This is one of the reasons why the direction of spirit arrival is very important. I mean, I find it very annoying when people talk to me whilst turning their back on me or half shoulder on me. I go, for heaven's sake, turn around and face me when you're talking to me. The spirit feels the same way. So you figure out where it's coming from. You put the triangle in that area if you're using a triangle, and you face them. And if you're not getting a result, you just turn slightly and see if you get not exactly a click, but the feeling that, I'm now in the right position. It's a bit like feng shui. You've got to be in the right position, facing in the right direction at the right time. So there's a slight parallel there. So that's important. You've got to give them the environment they want, and you've got to talk to them like they are rational. They have a completely different way of thinking about things to us. They don't have a moral compass or whatever the modern phrase is for that. They will do what they're asked to do if it's within the limits of their office. They need to know that you've got the power. I mean, the reason for a lot of the ritual equipment, the ritual equipment like the sword, that's a real threat to them. Iron is a real threat to them. But wearing a fake crown, as long as nobody tells them it's fake, has an effect, just as it would in an ordinary environment. When a king is on his throne and he's wearing a crown, you are deferential to him. The spirits are the same. And the spirit has got some acute senses and some not so acute senses. They don't see very well. I hope nobody repeats this to them, but they don't see very well, but they smell very well and they hear very well. So the ringing of a bell before you actually start the ritual is something that they will get used to. So use the same bell, you don't change it. I can parallel that in Indian temples. I've spent a fair bit of time in Indian temples in Assam and places like that. When a new worshipper comes in, he doesn't assume the gods are going to know that he's there, and there's a bell hung near the entrance which he'll ring with his hand, which will draw you can replace the word spirit or God as you wish, the attention of that entity to the fact that a new person has entered. And I'm not talking about the sort of temples which are tourist attractions. I'm talking about the sort of temples where real religion and real magic takes place. So those are two senses that they are acute.
To that point, Dr. Skinner, Frater Phosphor is also asking, is the use of music useful for Dr. Skinner in magic or in ritual? Have you ever employed that in terms of grimoire? Like, is it useful during a goetic operation to, have Benedictine chanting in the background? Or, I mean, how does music factor in, if at all?
I've never used music in magic, so I have to come clean on that. So there will be a lot of things that I don't know about that. I always associate music with either pleasure or religion or whatever. I imagine in a monastic environment there will be Gregorian chant in the background, but I don't think that's an essential piece. I think the only example I can think of where music was used was the hermetic operations that one of the popes did, where they set up an environment, a perfume, etc., but they also used Jupiterian music for Jupiter and Venusian music for Venus and so on. But I have no experience of that. If I'd failed early on, maybe I would have tried that. Which brings us now to things like tape recorders. I did experiment with tape recording invocations, and it didn't work. Somehow the human voice, or maybe the human breath, is important to communicate with the spirits. A tape recording of the invocation, leave it running on loop for a whole day, and nothing will happen. I also found that trying to record ceremonies so that you got the whole thing, frequently the tape recorder, and I'm talking about tape recorders so you all know that this is 20, 30, 40 years ago, would fail. So in the end I gave up. It's just like in crop circles now, electronic equipment fails. So I gave up on electronic equipment in a ritual circumstance.
I'm wondering too, Dr. Skinner, just to that point, when you engage with these spirits, again, without mentioning specific spirits in general, Frater Phosphor is asking, what's Dr. Skinner's perspective about whether spirits in the grimoires ever die or don't function, and if there are newer spirits, quote unquote, because they're not actually in a grimoire that's in a register, that magicians can't or are unable to work with them in the grimoire system. Have you ever experienced that?
That's an interesting thing. I've had the experience of evoking spirits which just didn't respond, like nothing, dead. So this may be because they're bound by another magician, which does happen, but not very often. Maybe they do die, I don't know. Or maybe it's just a bogus spirit name. So I don't really know what the answer is to that. As for new spirits, if you don't know their name, how can you command them?
Haven't you mentioned and written about before that one of the first things one must do, especially during an evocatory procedure, is to ascertain the actual name and appropriate name and sigil of the spirit?
Yeah, absolutely. You need its signature, which you wear in a certain way, and you need its name. It's like if you walk into a party and you call out, "Hey, John," and there's nobody there with the name John, nobody will respond to you. If you walk in and say, "Hey, you," they'll probably respond even less. You definitely need the name for spirits, which is the whole point of spirit registers. A spirit register will tell you what the spirits can do, what's the limit of their office, what are their favorite incenses, etc., etc. In Taoist magic, which I know we're not talking about, but I'm going to just divert from
please.
it. The whole process of initiation is not how people think of it now in a Golden Dawn sense. The whole process of initiation is that the master will give a new spirit register to an apprentice only when that apprentice has proved that he can actually command every spirit in the register that he was previously given. So they only give it piece by piece, piecemeal, but you have to prove that you can actually call them. There's no armchair cop-out. Oh, yeah, I read the book. Oh, yeah, I memorized the tables. No, that doesn't cut any ice at all. It is the most precious gift to be given a new register with instructions into how to use it, because then you've got new spirits you can call. But how anybody can give you a register with no names in it, I don't really see that working at all.
It's fascinating because I'm thinking of Joseph Peterson's The Secrets of Solomon, the Ars Rabidmidar, where in Book 3 there are the Heptameron spirits, and they're just angels of the north, south, east, and west in the Heptameron, but whoever was compiling or practicing with the Secrets of Solomon was deriving specific sigils of each of those angels and working with them. The angel Galdel, who's one of the angels of Mars, is just listed in the Heptameron, but in the Ars Rabidmidar, it says Galdel will give you many spirits as soldiers, as many as you desire. So it seems someone is working and deriving.
Yes, two things are happening there. Either that Ars Rabidmadar is drawing on earlier manuscripts or is being worked by magicians who are actually asking the spirit for elucidation. So once you call the spirit up, you can then get more information about them. You can force them to sign. The whole idea of a liber spiritum is that you take a double-page spread and you put what you know about the spirit down, and then in the course of the evocation, you ask it other questions and you fill that in, so that this is essentially how grimoires are generated. And so you finish up with a book of your successful evocations. There will be some pages with the name of the spirit, the date and time at the top, and nothing else. But hopefully in many more cases you will have the details. So you can ask the spirit what it does. What time does it like to be called? There's lots of useful things, and it will usually volunteer the information because it benefits both parties.
You have extensive experience, as you've mentioned, Dr. Skinner, with both the Key of Solomon and the Lemegeton, specifically the Goetia, is what we've been talking about. And I'm wondering your thoughts on something John King writes, where he says, quote, "The greater Key of Solomon, with its numerous consecration procedures, has no practical relationship to the Lemegeton. For instance, he says, any sword or rod will fulfill the functions required to hang the box from its chain, to mark the triangle, and to pass items out of the circle without stepping beyond it." So I guess I'm curious, like so many people I see online pay very, very meticulous attention to the Key of Solomon, and the ink must be consecrated exactly here, and then I can use that ink on the lion skin belt, for example, in the Lemegeton's Goetia. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Does the greater key have any relationship?
Okay, I would always encourage people to do as much as they possibly can, because you never know in the early days whether you're leaving out an essential bit or not. Iron per se, particularly sharp iron, consecrated or not, is something the spirits fear, which has always struck me as rather odd, but a useful piece of information. Spirits fear sharp iron, so that can be used. They fear the destruction of their sigils, so that can be used. Obviously, in the Greater Key of Solomon, there are a lot of talismans, and those talismans are a separate operation. They're not necessarily part of an evocation. So from that point of view, that stuff is not necessary. I mean, even in the Mathers, he shows a separate circle for talismanic consecrations from the one for evocations, showing that it's quite clearly two separate processes there. I wouldn't go quite as far as John King. I still like to do my consecrations and make my magical equipment and lock it up and bring it out on special occasions. But who knows, maybe that's just psychological. I hope not.
Right. Dr. Skinner, we have a question from Adley Nichols, who says, "I've spoken briefly to Joseph Peterson looking for confirmation of the order or lineage of the Heptameron in relation to the sworn book of Honorius." Adley's saying, "I would appreciate Dr. Skinner's thoughts on the Heptameron's origins and a possible source that it might share with the sworn book of Honorius."
At this point, it's still not possible to figure out what came first. I suspect that the Byzantine exorcism rituals probably a little bit earlier than either the Heptameron or the Goetia. I really wish somebody would find the missing links and we could trace it back. I traced the Greco-Egyptian papyri forward, first of all to Constantinople and then to Venice and northern Italy, but we still need to trace a number of things backwards. I'm sure that somewhere these manuscripts exist, but the trouble with librarians, particularly medieval librarians, is that if it's magic, they will not catalog it as magic, because that puts them in jeopardy. It's like the large number of Ars Notoria, which are listed as prayer manuals. Sometimes they just list them as Magica Varia, but that's not very helpful. And so you really got to sit down and take each manuscript and read it and catalog it yourself. At one stage I was doing that in the Bodleian Library. I was going through each of the potential grimoires there and writing down the details. Then the Bodleian computerized, and I know this is going right off topic, but it's something that irks me. And they gave the computerization to a company who employed ordinary typists. So you've got ordinary typists trying to figure out 16th century, 17th century handwriting, typing in Latin and sometimes not being able to read the handwriting. So as you can imagine, the result is a lot of information was left out. It should have been given to classically trained librarians to do. And worse than that, some of the records that I took down by hand from the card indexes in the Bodleian no longer exist on the computer system. I don't believe they've lost these manuscripts. I believe they're sitting on a shelf somewhere, but with no computer reference to their existence. And when I apply to the librarian for a particular manuscript, he'll say, not found, and demonstrate that it's not in the computer catalog. So one day I got a little bit more assertive, and he said, oh, okay, you can look at the old card indexes if you like, and double-check what you found. And he goes and opens an incredibly dusty, looks like a wardrobe, set of wardrobe drawers, and stacked from the floor, upside down, sideways on, were all the old drawers which had been pulled out of the manual catalogue system, covered in grime, with the cards spilling out on the floor, like, do you really want to do this? And so, of course, I went, no, I don't really want to do this. And so a number of pieces of information about individual manuscripts has been lost, which should have been computerized. And worse than that, references to whole manuscripts which I know existed because I took their details down in the 1970s, no longer exist in the wonderful world of digital cataloging.
That might explain why, if someone's looking for the origin, this common origin perhaps that the Heptameron and the Liber Iuratus share, perhaps it's, as you mentioned, it's in a library somewhere, it's not cataloged properly.
Of course, the other thing is which library, because one of the things that Daniel's very good at is tracking stuff down. And he's discovered libraries with collections of manuscript in which none of the current people interested in magic have ever mentioned or thought about. I won't upstage him by saying which ones, but he's found some fabulous collections which are never mentioned by anybody, and so he's gradually working through them. So that will produce some results. But I think the libraries that need to be looked through are the libraries in Istanbul. It's no use trying to find what happened to the libraries in Alexandria, because they were all consigned to the bakehouse furnaces in the 7th century. You know the story, don't you, that the commander who conquered Alexandria discovered many hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls and things. And so he wrote back to the Sultan and said, what am I supposed to do with these? And the Sultan replied, look at them. If they duplicate the information that's in the Quran, then it's not necessary, because we've got the Quran, so you can burn them. And if the information is outside of the Quran, then it's of no value, so you can burn them. So what do? He burned them. It's just very sad that those can never be reconstructed. So there will be missing links, but I think there must be a number of Middle Eastern libraries which have still got some of those links. But you need to be an expert in so many languages to investigate it, and just limited knowledge of Greek and Latin really isn't enough. So hopefully some future generation will do it. But it's more than just intellectual satisfaction to be able to trace down the roots, because if you trace down the roots and you found, for example, the original Golden Flowers by Apollonius of Tyana, a lot of queries and things might be easily settled, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. So we have to just do with medieval and manuscripts and gradually put the bits and pieces together.
Absolutely. We'll definitely keep our fingers crossed for that as well. Questions, Dr. Skinner? One is actually from Cash, who's saying, has Dr. Skinner decided whether he will continue working on a how-to technical manual for magic?
Well, I am still working on it. The trouble with the how-to is that it's like any scientific endeavor, and it's in a scientific endeavor, you need to test it. And each time testing just takes time. And so I'm getting there. I've thought several times about the advisability or not of publishing a how-to manual. If I could figure out an apprenticeship system where only people who had the right outlook on this or the right abilities got to have copies, that would be one thing. But the commercial publishing machine doesn't allow for those kind of fine distinctions.
Dr. Skinner, thank you so much for just taking the time and chatting with our listeners and our patrons. Really, really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Listeners and Glitch Bottle patrons, I hope you enjoyed that chat with Dr. Skinner as much as I did, and Glitch Bottle patrons can also enjoy exclusive content on patreon.com/glitchbottle, and thanks so much to each and every one of you patrons. You are the sole esoteric fuel and support, keeping the lights on and energizing the show and taking it to new levels of support and content. If you'd like to jump on the Glitch Bottle caravan with us, please consider visiting patreon.com/glitchbottle to find out more. And as always, you can subscribe to Glitch Bottle on YouTube and listen on Spotify, Spreaker.com, Stitcher Radio, and iTunes. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a review with shiny stars on iTunes is always most welcome when you have a moment. It is an absolute pleasure to chat with Glitch Bottle patrons and listeners, and as always, this is Alexander F. reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.